Thank you, Sarah. Yes, welcome back to day 2. Now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Cristina Wilkins, whose work I've been following for a long time. Cristina is a PhD candidate at the University of New England, Australia, researching the 1 welfare outcomes of human-horse interactions. Her work in exploring how equipment-related pressures affect equine welfare led to an invited presentation to the FEI Veterinary Committee earlier this year, which I hope you all have checked out. Cristina collaborates with leading welfare scientists on practical tools for assessment, including the Mellorator app, and she developed UNE's online course applying the 5 domains model to the welfare assessment of sport and recreation horses, which we heard a bit about. A former international eventing competitor, coach, official, and longtime editor of Horses and People magazine. Cristina combines, Cristina combines academic research with deep industry experience. Her science communication and advocacy have supported welfare initiatives across equestrian and racing organizations. She served on the ISES Council from 2011 to 2019 and is a co-author of the 2020 5 domains model, including human-animal interactions in assessments of animal welfare. Cristina lives in Queensland, Australia, and the topic is seeing pressure, evidence and responsibility in modern equitation. Cristina, welcome.
Hi, Lisa. So thank you, Nina, and thank you all the Sarahs and the ISES Council for the invitation and for curating such an engaging and thought-provoking program. It's been a real privilege to be here and to learn from the diverse contributions so far. Each one a reminder of the complexity of equitation science and the responsibility we share in shaping its future. It is my pleasure to contribute to the sub-theme of training and equipment, an area consistently identified by equestrians as the most pressing concern when it comes to sport horse welfare. Earlier this year, as Nina mentioned, my PhD supervisors, academic mentors, co-authors, and I sent a formal letter of concern to several equestrian sport governing bodies. We took this step because our data sets showed that the pressures applied through regulated bridles during competition are exceeding the biological limits of the tissues they are affecting. The letter prompted significant interest, and it led to a very constructive meeting with the FEI Veterinary Committee in April, and ultimately to this invitation to speak today about our experience and the broader issue of equipment-induced pressures. So before I get into that, I'd like to take a moment to clarify how this all began, and a warning that my presentation does contain some confronting images. As Nina said, I'm currently halfway through my PhD investigating factors that affect the 1 welfare outcomes of human-horse interactions. I take a 1 welfare approach, considering animal welfare, human well-being, and the wider social impacts, such as community trust, which is emerging as a critical pressure point for equestrian sport. My research is grounded in the 5 domains model, which in horse welfare terms means taking the animal's perspective. And I'll be talking more about the influence that 2 CSU scholars and academics, Professor Temple Grandin and the late distinguished Professor Bernie Rollin, as well as Professor Emeritus David Mello, have had on my approach. So I'm applying a 1 welfare perspective in the application of the model, following the lead set by Laurent Stallones, also from CSU, there must be something in the water here, with Phil McManus and Paul McGreevy, who did this in a racing context. Behaviour, welfare, and restrictive equipment, such as nosebands and tongue ties, have been the recurring theme in my work because most of our interactions with horses rely on applying aversive pressures, and understanding how people use equipment and why is central to understanding the welfare outcomes. And yes, when the evidence has pointed to harm and better alternatives exist, I have found myself advocating for change. A significant turning point in my PhD journey happened last year at the 2024 ISES conference in Cambridge, where we heard from Professor Craig Johnson, a pioneer in research on pain in animals, and Professor Paul McGreevy, whose plenary, A Good Life for Horses, Why Should We Bother and How Can One Advocate, included this very memorable message from a member of the Australian Armed Forces. At the same time, images of horses with so-called blue tongues exploded across mainstream media. The first were high-resolution photographs taken at the Amsterdam World Cup event in January 2024 by fine art photographer Crispin Perelius Johannessen. Paul, alongside with Dr. Kati Tuomola, a veterinarian with a PhD in bit-induced oral lesions, were there on the front line, putting their advocacy principles into action. The media attention was instantly met with attempts to discredit the photos, with claims they were digitally manipulated or isolated and unfortunate moments in time that are not representative of the winning performances. But I know Crispin personally and professionally. His work is meticulous, high quality, and trustworthy. So we invited him and Kati to join our research team to help us explore this issue. The quality and quantity of images that Crispin is collecting and the archive that he's documenting is outstanding and continues to grow. It is a very powerful, convenient sample that clearly shows what's been hiding in plain sight, that all the equipment we use on the horse's head is specifically designed to apply pressure, and that regardless whether it's in the hand of the most experienced professionals, the forces that it can apply, and often does apply, can exceed the biological limits of the tissues affected. And here we're talking about every horse in the top classes from first to last, image sequences. This is what I can't show today, is the image sequences. Every image that you see in this presentation has a context around it of images leading up to it and images leading away from it. So they are representative of entire 8-minute-long performances, and they're happening in the field of play under rules that state that the most important task for the judge is to keep the welfare of the horse in mind. Therefore, he/she must pay special attention to all signs of discomfort and penalize them significantly. Now, we heard yesterday from Inga, her excellent presentation yesterday shed some light on the cognitive challenges that judges face. If identifying signs of discomfort is their most important task, either we're setting them with an impossible task, or they do not see the same signs of welfare compromise that we do. After all, they have had access to many of these images over the past 18 months. And the question, whether they see the same indicators of pain and distress that we do, is a genuine question. I'm not being facetious. As a lifelong rider with professional experience, I had completely normalized the use of headgear and bits. But I was, and I continue to be shocked, to be honest, by the extent and the scale of the problems they reveal. And I'm flooded with questions about just what's going on. So for the last year, as a team, with the help of this incredible group of researchers, Professor Paul McGreevy, Dr. Catherine Henschel, Dr. Kati Tuomola, Crispin, Professor Emeritus David Mello, and my principal supervisor, Professor Amy Likens, we've been reviewing tens of thousands of Crispin's photographs and also watched video recordings of performances available on the FEI channel Clip My Horse. Meanwhile, the media has continued to discuss the blue tongues, and more photos have emerged from Crispin and other photographers at other events, including the Paris Olympics. The riders, trainers, and some officials question what these images actually represent, and there are discussions about whether there's a need to set acceptable and therefore unacceptable thresholds for blueness of the tongue. We then get to the Amsterdam World Cup event in January this year, which Crispin attended. He photographed the entire Grand Prix class and prioritized processing and sharing with the team the photos of horses and riders he'd photographed a year earlier. But the findings were just the same, and although for our project we are actively selecting images that show tongue and gum because it more clearly shows a color contrast unrelated to lighting conditions, we're just as concerned about the degree of compression of the oral tissues and the stretching and wrinkling of the lips, the hyperflexed necks, the protective behaviors these horses are displaying in all the photos, and the lack, especially the lack of meaningful and sustained rein releases from the riders. So rather than wait until we published our findings in February, we communicated our concerns in the form of a formal letter addressed to the national and international regulatory bodies responsible for the welfare of the seven of the horses in our data sets. We gave them access to folders with a selection of images we had been reviewing, and we were promptly and cordially invited to present our concerns to the veterinary committee, to the FEI veterinary committee in April. So we took on the challenge, and we were able to put together a presentation, and we pre-recorded it to ensure that every member of the team could speak to their field of expertise. And we later published it on YouTube for full transparency and to disseminate this information to a wider audience. Our aims were to highlight that the data sets are not moments in time, but representative of the entire performances. And I believe that by showing entire image sequences that you can see in the video, and by explaining our selection methodology, we succeeded in putting those claims to rest. We also wanted to explain our intentions and the scientific basis of why we conclude these data are evidence of horses performing under painful and significantly aversive conditions, but also to offer some solutions or avenues for moving forward. We came up with 7 steps, and here I have highlighted 2 that would help align current judging with the ISES training principles, and then number 6, which would allow for monitoring equipment-induced pressure more objectively and while the equipment is in use during the performance, which is what matters to the horses. We also insist that more invasive research, for example, to prove that highly compressed and stretched oral tissues and discolored tongues are or are not painful, is not required. What we are seeing is pain, and this understanding comes from the foundational work of Professor Emeritus David Mello, who, as well as the work that he's done in physiology and with the 5 domains model, with his colleagues, including Kevin Stafford and Craig Johnson, who delivered the Clever Hans lecture at last year's conference in Cambridge. Over 30 years of research on husbandry procedures practiced on lambs, calves, piglets, deer, horses, dogs, and goats has shown that compression, constriction, crushing, and cutting of sensitive tissues causes pain. Pain was confirmed using specific pain indicators and cortisol responses, which were then validated, thanks to the studies led by Craig Johnson, by changes in brain electrical activity, so EEG patterns already linked to conscious pain in humans. Together, this large body of work, comprising over 100 peer-reviewed articles, confirms that these physiological and behavioral signs are not just stress, they indicate conscious pain in animals. So what we see in Crispin's high-definition images are clear signs of compression, constriction, and in some cases cutting of exquisitely sensitive tissues. We are very confident that these are painful because the horses are also attempting to protect themselves, to resolve, escape, or avoid these forces by opening their mouths, hyperflexing and shortening the neck, and sometimes balling the tongues and other behaviors that they're able to perform. What we are proposing is that these signs be treated as welfare indicators in their own right, because while we do need pain ethograms for horses under saddle, accepting evidence that pressure is an indicator might help disincentivize practices aimed at restricting the horse's ability to display pain and protective behaviors, or concealing them, because tight nosebands, artificial foam, Botox on eyes and lips, and nerve-blocking tails are all attempts to silence the horse and prevent them from displaying their comfort more obviously to the judges and other observers, stewards, veterinarians, and other observers who are there to safeguard their welfare. So what's happened since? The video has had 25,500 views and one single dissenting comment in almost 160 from someone who complained that we didn't include a remarkable trainer in our scientific team. I was a bit offended. But the question we get most often was what has happened since the meeting and has the FEI fixed this? So I'm not here to talk about that. It's not my place to talk about what the sports are or are not doing. But I do know there is a very dedicated team led by Göran Åkerström working really hard to make improvements. We're still collecting data. Our images taken at the international dressage event at Falsterbo 2 weekends ago suggest that for the horses, nothing much has changed. The images are from Falsterbo are still being processed, but here we have some photos of one horse in the Prix St. George class, and he was photographed in the warm-up and the dressage test, and the stewards were alerted by an independent observer that the horse had a blue tongue, and this was during the warm-up, but the horse went on to compete and placed third in the class. And by the way, it's not just dressage, and we do have an archive of other disciplines. And here is the show jumping at Falsterbo 2 weekends ago as well. So what I want to do next is to focus on what's happened within our research team. Because one unexpected gift of this experience was the intense and high-pressure environment it created. It really put us under pressure. And it's what Paul called hothouse conditions. It was a kind of focused, fast-paced collaboration that pushed all of us to bring our very best thinking forward. And as we continue to work through our research questions and we prepare our articles, we are keeping an equicentric approach. Because the question that's really worth our time is what's going on for these horses. But given the ongoing reluctance from some in the sport and other fields to concede that these are signs of welfare compromise, we've made a point of starting from first principles by clearly stating the assumptions that underpin our scientific approach. I know many of these that I'm going to mention will be very familiar to all of you, but we're not taking any of them for granted. We're starting from the ground up. So we start out by acknowledging animal sentience. Horses are sentient beings capable of experiencing both pleasant and unpleasant emotional state. And although the vast majority of the population agree on this one, it does pay to remember that the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, of Animal Consciousness, is only 13 years old, and many countries are yet to recognize animal sentience in their legislation. So, animals' biology, behavior, and subjective experiences are interdependent and dynamically influence one another. They have evolved to help animals survive and thrive within particular environments. So using a broad range of observations and measures of biological function and behavior, we can infer the animal's subjective experiences. Animals are not a black box. And crucially, welfare is a state, and what matters to the animal in welfare terms is how they feel, how they experience their life world. Welfare assessments must therefore be grounded in the animal's perspective. So in this context, the animal's negative experiences are associated with compromised welfare, while positive experiences reflect enhanced welfare. And we also recognize that welfare is dynamic and can fall along a spectrum between these two states. So as well as providing opportunities for positive, rewarding experiences, safeguarding welfare requires giving the horse the opportunity to resolve and to learn how to avoid situations they find aversive, when they're motivated to do so. This is what we mean by taking the animal's perspective. In terms of definition in our work, we also adopt the definition of pain put forward by the International Association for the Study of Pain in 2020, which Gemma presented so well yesterday. And this definition explains the functional role of pain as an evolved protection mechanism against bodily injury. And it is a subjective experience that is unpleasant by design, because it has evolved to motivate the horse to take protective action. So we use pain to describe experiences across a continuum, from low, which may signal the risk of tissue damage, to severe, excruciating pain, indicating that the horse has perceived significant or survival-threatening injury has occurred. In welfare terms, pain and fear are very closely related because fear describes a mental state in which the animal anticipates harm and behaves accordingly, either by taking or attempting avoidance actions. So they're kind of like the two sides of the same coin. Importantly, fear can arise before actual damage occurs and in the absence of any damage. But from the horse's perspective, even if their physical health is intact, the perception of threat means their welfare is compromised to a similar degree as if injury had occurred. So just as pain, we refer to the broad spectrum of threat-related emotional experiences, from mild unease to intense fear simply as fear. And finally, while fear and pain have protective functions and cannot be eliminated or avoided altogether, safeguarding horse welfare means doing everything possible to help them return to a state that is free of both. We may never know exactly what's going on inside the horse's head, but we do know enough about the natural history of horses to consider the pressures we apply and their effects in terms of their biological relevance. We can determine how they might be perceived and processed in affective terms by the horse by considering affect as an evolved mechanism for detecting, evaluating, and responding to threats and opportunities. And this is key to how we're approaching the question of what's going on for the horses in our data set. This links our work back to Tim Bergen's 4 foundational questions, and it intersects closely with the research that Kath Henschel presented yesterday on predictive processing and the neuroscience of learning. It also builds on foundational work by Mike Mendel and Elizabeth Paul on the dimensions of core affect, and that were also mentioned yesterday in some of the talks, but also its influence on decision-making in animals. And it draws from LeCourbe's and Weary's recent and very exciting contribution on the Bayesian brain, which is a model of prediction-based perception, or using prior knowledge to interpret sensory input, and its application in animal welfare context. So together, these works reveal that social interactions are actually a series of decision events, each carrying affective weight, shaping experience and influencing future behavior. So when you add that we have 2 very different species interacting, each with their own sensory systems and life priorities, this model becomes very interesting for figuring out what's happening during interactions. I have here an example to show how this might work. And here we have a moment in time. This is a moment where the handler is applying downward pressure on the lead rope, which the horse detects as pressure on the pole. This is going to immediately influence their affective state. And we know it is likely to be negatively valenced because as soon as it motivates the horse to resolve it. And because we know that horses readily learn how to avoid these pressures. There are various behavioral options available to the horse, from staying still, lifting the head, lowering the head, moving it to the left, to the right, biting the handler. There are many options available. So the decision event can be seen as the moment when the horse lays a bet on the action that they predict will lead to the most positive outcome from their perspective. And this is the affective prediction. What matters to us from our anthropocentric perspective might be the behavioral outcome, but what matters to the horse is the affective outcome, how they feel about what just happened. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Because the horse doesn't arrive at this moment in time as a blank state. They bring with them current physical and emotional state, and that's their underlying mood, and an archive of experiences, of memories, some inherited, shaped by ancestral natural selection, and some accumulated during their lifetime. And these are not affectively neutral. They have a valence, which is good and bad, they feel good and bad, and an intensity. And all these things are interacting, influencing, and being influenced by each other. But importantly, they are influencing the perceived aversiveness of the pressure stimulus that's just been applied. Because whether the horse, and again, Gemma explained this yesterday with pain, whether the horse is already in a positive and calm state versus being already in a negative or fearful state is going to change their perception of the level of threat that pressure means. And this is going to affect the affective prediction. So the affective prediction is what governs motivation. And as a result, it's going to influence the behavioral choice the horse makes and the amount of effort they will invest in resolving this, in trying to resolve the situation. Now, we still don't know exactly what's going on in their head, but we do know that comfort and safety are highly valued by horses, and therefore the prediction that a certain behavior will bring this about is going to be highly motivated. And then it gets more complicated than that. Because the affective outcome has its own valence and intensity, but aside from whether the outcome feels good or feels bad, what's likely to matter to the horse is whether the effective prediction they made was accurate and the effective outcome is or isn't as they expected. And the size and valence of any gap is the prediction error, and it's likely to be particularly salient because its function is to influence future decision. It governs learning, because outcomes that are better or worse than expected will be remembered for making a more accurate prediction next time. And all of this is going to influence the horse's mood and emotion. So if the outcome is as or better than expected, it's more likely the horse will repeat the behavior. If the outcome is worse than expected, the horse may trial alternative behaviors next time. As you can see, this all ties in with Kath's very interesting talks yesterday. And of course, it gets more complicated than that because the human is also influencing the horse's affective state. The human and the attachment bond the human has with the horse, whether they have a trusting relationship or not, is going to contribute to or erode a horse's sense of safety even before they pull down on that rope, which will also affect how the horse perceives the pressure when they detect it and how they make predictions. And yesterday, the excellent presentation by Sarah Rieger on equipment use in therapeutic riding made me realize that it can be even more complicated than that when there are two, sometimes more people involved in an interaction. So there is definitely a lot going on for the horse, many variables and influences on their emotional state. But some questions I want to actually leave you with, because I don't have the answers, is during training, are we modifying behavior or are we adjusting the horse's expectations? Are we lowering or raising the horse's expectations? And following that, is our training making horses optimistic or pessimistic about being able to resolve and control bridle pain? And what about the many horses who acquire behaviors during their training years that we consider dangerous or problematic? Were they making different predictions? And if so, why? So I'm just going to leave you with those questions to ponder on. We, our research team, we're trying to understand the sorts of predictions the horses in our data sets are making about the bridle pressures. In the video presentation to the FEI Veterinary Committee, Kath listed some of the ideas we're exploring. And what follows now is a tribute to three thinkers who have most influenced the way I'm trying to make sense of these complexities. The first is Emeritus Professor David Mello, who, as we heard yesterday, has been tireless in his insistence that studying subjective experiences of animals is not only legitimate, but scientifically rigorous and necessary. And he applied the precautionary principle at a time when most dismissed the possibility, treating it as unscientific. But his work has laid the foundation for much of what we now take for granted in welfare science. And the next two thinkers I want to acknowledge are part of the intellectual fabric of this university, and it's a real privilege to be speaking about their influence here on their home turf. Professor Temple Grandin, of course, helped me realize quite early on that animals experience the world through their own and unique perceptual filters, shaped by species and individual differences, and above all, that their perspectives matter, and we must take them seriously. And the late distinguished Professor Bernie Rollin, whose work helped me connect with a crucial idea, that animals only make sense when we consider the environments they evolved in. Rollin used the term telos to argue that each species has a nature shaped by natural selection, and that we have a responsibility to respect it. For him, welfare meant keeping animals in ways that align with who they are biologically and behaviorally. For horses, you can think of the 3 Fs, friends, forage, and freedom. But with the term telos, Rollin was describing an animal's phenotype in terms of an evolved suite of traits that are not merely present, but active and functional in real-world contexts. His memorable metaphor, the pigness of the pig, the dogness of the dog, condenses a wide array of species-specific traits and tendencies into an intuitive expression of how a pig, a dog, or a horse for that matter, have evolved to function. Rollin asserted that if we constrain or alter an animal so they cannot express their telos, in other words, they cannot be the animal they evolved to be, we violate something fundamental, even if we keep them in ways that avoid causing pain, hunger, or disease. Yesterday's Clever Hans lecture by Rick Hester was a masterclass on how the telos concept can be applied in practice to improve the lives of wild animals living in captive environments. And in the online course that I developed for UNE on applying the 5 domains model, I suggest ways to use telos to improve the welfare of sports and recreation horses. And I think it's a lot easier than with mountain lions. Both are examples of applying a teleonomic or teleological approach because they focus on what animals are trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, and why. And it can shed light on what matters to them. The teleonomic approach aligns with developments in human affective neuroscience and evolutionary biology as well. But in human affective neuroscience, the Human Affectome Project, which maps the biological basis of emotional experience and offers an integrative framework for understanding affective phenomena, is an example of a teleonomic approach. And building on that, my co-authors and I are almost ready to submit an article exploring the animal affectome and how it could contribute to welfare science and conservation, particularly if we account for the telos of each species. This is because animals differ widely in their biology, sensory capacities, cognitive abilities, ethograms, and ecological niches, and any attempt to understand animal affect must be grounded in the varied ways by which they perceive and experience the world, as well as account for the environmental conditions they are adapted to. The topic of controlling the heads of horses with equipment that applies pressure is a good example to explore using a teleonomic approach, at least in my opinion, because the head and neck plays a key role in foraging, drinking, and social interaction. But biomechanically, it really matters to both horses and humans, because the weight of the head and the muscularity of the neck mean that deliberately changing its position will affect the horse's balance, center of mass, and their ability to move. And throughout history, humans have leveraged this approach and this aspect of the horse's telos, so the head and neck is part of their evolved anatomy, and it impacts their physiology and behavior. And we've been able to control their movement, which is what we're interested in. We're interested in their locomotion, particularly through controlling the head and neck. And depending whose perspective you take, horse or human, control of the head and neck is an asset and a vulnerability. It's kind of like the horse's Achilles heel. Horses have evolved to use the head and neck to resist or avoid predator attacks, but humans have a technological advantage. We develop tools to override those responses, designing bridles that apply pressure where it yields the greatest mechanical and psychological advantage. The leverage afforded to the human through controlling head height and bending the neck of a horse of any size is demonstrated by the recommended technique for restraining a recumbent horse. This method is taught by the fabulous Rebecca Jimenez in large animal rescues. It allows even a light-frame person to safely and efficiently prevent a horse from attempting to rise, provided a halter is fitted to the head. So this is quite a big innovation brought in by Rebecca and her colleagues. It involves placing a single foot and some weight on the neck, just behind the atlanto-occipital joint, the pole, while pulling upwards on a rope attached to the side ring of a halter. And this tips the nose skyward. It flexes the pole. That's what we say in dressage. This technique disrupts the craniocervical junction that horses rely upon to get back on their feet. But controlling neck flexion can also influence the horse's locomotion. So by controlling neck flexion, you can also influence the horse in motion, and is also demonstrated by horsemanship teachings that have persisted through millennia. The most blunt, modern example is in natural horsemanship approaches that describe neck flexions and one-rein stops as useful for preventing the brace, to disengage the hindquarters, and as a technique for installing emergency brakes. But it is also obvious in dressage teachings, ancient and contemporary, which devote extraordinary attention to head and neck flexions, lateral, longitudinal, or both, with riders dedicating countless hours to influencing and perfecting the horse's head and neck posture with increasing precision, riding endless circles, serpentines, and lateral movements. In theory, it is a means to obtain collection, enhanced balance under saddle, but as the FEI dressage judging guidelines suggest, it is also about compliance or submission. We know that because horses find pressure so aversive, they can be trained to maintain head and neck flexions in self-carriage, that is with no rein pressure, but head and neck flexions can also be achieved and maintained mechanically. And the horse gear catalogs are full of bridles and bits of various designs, each sold according to its action and with the rider's aims in mind. What we need is to take an equicentric approach and consider what matters to the horse about that equipment. This table aims to classify equipment by the anatomical structures that affect the horse when the rider pulls on reins or ropes. This is half the table. It's the part that includes common types of halters and bit-free bridles. And the double crosses indicate that the design affords the rider, a handler, a mechanical advantage, meaning that it multiplies the forces that the rider applies with via mechanical levers or pulleys. This part of the table is for bitted bridles. Again, the double crosses indicate the rein forces are multiplied through levers or pulleys. And as Paul will mention this afternoon, we are looking forward to the possibility of creating an anatomically accurate model, similar to those used in veterinary practice, that has pressure sensors embedded in all these areas of the horse's head, so that the welfare risk of different types of equipment can be tested without subjecting horses to invasive research. In terms of the pressures being applied in competition, I created this illustration because I had to figure out how this bridle was working. It's a type of combination bridle from a photograph taken by Dr. Sue Dyson at a show jumping event. And on the side are some of the hundreds of different designs available on the market. Currently, in show jumping, there are no real restrictions on the use or design of combination bridles, although the United States Equestrian Federation has just announced that abrasive nosebands will no longer be allowed unless they are made of rawhide, not because they are not abrasive, but because they are of a traditional design. So meanwhile, in the discipline of dressage, the federations are, the riders and trainers and coaches and all the people who vote and who manage the rule changes are reluctantly considering making double bridles optional at the higher levels, but there is quite a lot of resistance. This video helped me understand why we see such high compression and sometimes blue tongues associated with double bridles. That, by the way, is my leg. So bits with curb chains are actually designed to trap and compress the tongue between the mouthpiece and the mandible. It's kind of like a shortcut to putting a tongue tie, or it really helps to trap the tongue so the horses can't get the tongue over the bit. And they act as a second-class lever of the nutcracker type. And I actually have this set up with me. If anyone wants to give it a go, please see me during a break. Riders insist that double bridles are better because they feel their horses become lighter and rounder. But basic physics suggests that this very basic weigh-mouth, just by measuring it and applying the equations for a second-class lever, could be multiplying the pulling forces applied by the rider by 4 times, just this very basic design. So the biofeedback these riders are reporting on is very unreliable and anthropocentric, which is why we must insist, again, that everyone take an equicentric approach. This unreliable biofeedback from the riders should be also considered in combination with the current FEI judging guidelines, which state on at least 30 occasions that riders should always maintain a contact, and stress that judges should penalize visible rein releases, because contact increases the risks from the horse's perspective. But let's not forget there's a risk to humans. Nobody gets into horses to do them harm, and yet harm is what we are seeing in our data sets. So from a human welfare perspective, the risk is cognitive dissonance, and the unhealthy strategies people may use to reduce that dissonance, such as denying, minimizing, or normalizing the harmful effects of pressure. These can lead to moral disengagement, compromise personal integrity, and as a result, damage community trust. As Equestrians, the only sustainable dissonance reduction strategy we should engage in is to bring our actions in line with our values when they become obvious, and we need to maintain our promise to be horse guardians. All the time we have gear on the horse's head that applies pressure, we must monitor and mitigate the potential harms. By reducing the horse's exposure to continuous and or high levels of pressure, we can reduce the horse's exposure. The technology to help us identify this, because it is difficult to see with the naked eye, does exist. We've got it here. High-definition photography to monitor the compression, stretching, constriction of tissues during the performances when the pressures are being applied, rather than waiting for an oral examination to see whether we broke the horse. And rein tensiometry to monitor that riders are aiming for self-carriage. And we must set up a judging system that incentivizes training horses to be optimistic about their ability to resolve and avoid equipment-induced pressures, all of them. So to conclude, seeing pressure is seeing welfare risk. For the horses, the risk is of significant pain and potential bodily injury to biologically crucial anatomical structures. And the repercussions of ignoring these risks are bad for all of us. So all equipment that applies pressure to horses is a one welfare issue. Thank you.
We're perfect. We are perfect on time. We are retrieving the Q&A mics from the back here. Cristina, fabulous talk, important topic. It can be distressing to see these images, this clearly and this up front, but as you concluded, we have to see pressure to understand the risks involved. And now we will open it up. We have plenty of time, in fact, for a productive Q&A, and we will get started.
Yeah, Cristina, thank you for, in some way, controversial presentation. I liked it. I have actually 2 questions and a comment, mainly to the first part of your presentation. You were addressing primarily the judges. Isn't the public, aren't the spectators who really applaud these riders are an even bigger problem? That is a question. The comment, Your inference from pain studies in farm animals subjected to certain procedures like castration. This is highly likely to be correct, but my opinion is if we want legally binding regulation in horses, we need experimental studies to be done in horses. This inference is not enough. The results from these studies must be convincing. I expect some of them to be shocking. But before we engage on such experiments, don't we have to answer the general ethical question, are humans allowed to control horses? Thank you.
Okay. So that was 3 questions. So in answer to the first, I've already forgotten the first question. I was focused on the... Oh yes, the public, the responsibility of the public. Yes, absolutely. But it was very interesting at the 2024 FEI Forum to hear the trainers and coaches and Olympic riders, as I think it was Monica Teodorescu, who said that they can train riders and horses to do whatever the judges will reward. So if the judging changes, I think she was implying that if the judging changes, they will change their methodologies. So that's answer to the first question. The second question is that I understand your position on the research. However, we disagree. I think we have to be very careful, especially in the field of equitation science, which is very public, and it's an intersection between the community and science, that we manage the science is social license as well. And we believe that the science is convincing because these horses are not just passively habituating to these pressures, they are actively trying to resolve them, but we don't see that they are able to in our dressage performances, for example. And the last question is the ethical question, and I'm here to advocate for science, and I'm going to leave the ethics to everybody else to decide, because I'm not here to tell anybody what to do.
Thank you, Cristina. Good morning, everybody. I don't have a question, sorry, but I do feel that I have to comment. To start off with, and I'm going to try and formulate my thoughts that are sort of racing at about 100 miles an hour in a rational manner. I would like to caution, because Cristina, it was a fantastic talk. And yes, you heard me talk about visual search behavior in judging yesterday, and yesterday I showed you the search behavior of 3 judges, but I can tell you, as I also did yesterday, it's very similar to all other judges. What I would like to caution is, let's not start a witch hunt. We're all in this together. And all these judges, they are doing their very best. And yes, I also get frustrated with them, as I've spoken to many of you about this, but not because I think that they're the group primarily at fault here, simply because they are also part of the system. And we mustn't forget that change also takes a long time. But there is a system in place. And yes, all of us, because we sit here, we are trained to look at these pain expressions. The judges are there to do a job, to look at the whole picture. And the biggest issue is they keep telling me, I look at the whole horse, which they don't. I've shown you this yesterday. But what we are looking at, when we're looking at this, we're looking at just the mouth, but we're not looking at the rest of the horse. So imagine you're there. The whole world watches what you do as a judge, because please don't underestimate the enormous pressure that they're under. Because ever since we made judging transparent, everybody knows the score that every single judge gives. Judges have told me themselves that they get WhatsApp messages, and they shouldn't have the phones on, etc., but they're human, about people texting them, oh, you gave them a 10, and they shouldn't be looking at their phones, etc. But so the pressure is enormous. So what I'm trying to say is they have to look at the different elements, and then they try and look at the performance of the horse, and we see the mouths. I'm not saying that this is good, and I do think we should help them, but we shouldn't start a witch hunt. What we should do is try and work together with them to help them which elements of the horse they should be looking at, and then not just the contact is steady or whatever else, but precisely what it is that you need to look at in order to determine what the issues are. I hope that makes sense. So this is, so sorry, Cristina, it's not a question, but it's just something that I feel that we need to remind ourselves is not just one group. Okay, hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Inga, and I hope I didn't give the impression that the judges are the whole problem. Okay, yeah. No, I totally agree that everybody is working within a system, and there are many pressures on everyone. And this is why we think that, and we suggested in our presentation, that the judging guidelines do not align with the training principles. And therefore, it's incentivizing the wrong things. And we could change that. But of course, the judging guidelines are changed by the riders, by the trainers, by the national federations. It's a horrendously complex and difficult human negotiation process. And I really take my hat off to Joran for the work that he is doing in the FEI.
Hi, Cristina. Fantastic talk. Thank you. Kaylee Copeland, University of Guelph. I just kind of adding on to the judging commentary here, and maybe a question for you. Obviously, again, judging is an incredibly complex task that has been set for our judges. But even now, we're seeing in dressage judges not following the existing criteria for judging. If we look at hyperflexion, for example, the FEI dressage judging manual states noses should be on or slightly in front of the vertical, but we're seeing riders who are riding behind the vertical in movements like the piaffe being rewarded for that. And I know it's a complex system for judges, like Inga has said. How do we then either support judges or create some level of oversight for them when those judging criteria are not being followed for whatever reason, whether it's lack of ability to catch it or a lack of education, or for some, I'm sure, a priority of other aspects of the horse rather than things like head and neck or mouth position?
Thank you. Excellent question. And again, that's very much a sports question. And I really do want to stay away from giving my opinions on how this should be managed, because I have no idea. It is a massive human behavior problem, or it's just a massive, it's human behavior. So we need to approach it from lots of different angles. And I think one thing that I will say is that behavior change is not always slow. Behavior can change like that, and COVID was a really good example. And we can, when there's the right reasons, behavior does change. So I think it is possible, and yeah, but the negotiation is painstaking. Yeah.
So when we talk about these issues, we talk a lot about judges, we talk a lot about trainers and riders. But what do you see as the responsibility of the owners? A lot of these horses are not owned by the people that are competing them. They're owned by somebody else or a federation or an organization that truly has the ultimate control over the environment where that horse is. I mean, it seems to me in all of these conversations for years, the owners are kind of getting a free pass. I mean, if that's my horse, I can take it out of Patrick Kittle's barn and take it somewhere else. Where's the responsibility to the owner of the horse?
Thank you. You make a really good point, and I think I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the social license threatening the whole human-horse interaction from top to bottom, and us not being allowed to keep horses or ride horses or whatever. I don't believe that's the case. It's a similar, but don't get it wrong, example is when they banned dog fighting, they didn't ban people from keeping dogs. So I don't think that banning horse riding is a threat, but I do think that these things will seriously affect the financial viability of the sport, because I think more owners are going to be turned away from the sport, and sponsors. And we already saw earlier this year Blue Horse, which is owned by the Lego family, the Lego empire. They actually withdrew from competition for 3 months to try and figure out what they were doing. The same we were. What's going on? Yeah. So they asked the same question, and so yes. So I think it's a. They also paid Andreas Helfstein for how many decades? Yeah. Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? Yeah.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Hi, Erin Kirby, University of Illinois. Thank you for the wonderful talk. And I want to bring it back a little bit more to the research here. I was really interested to see that you're developing a model to measure the pressure from the bridle, so we can have more objective data about that, which I think is fabulous. I have a close friend in my university that develops models for our veterinary students to work on to help that. So I think that's a wonderful tool to have. But I'm wondering about we learned yesterday more about the subjective pain experience of the horse. So where do you see that subjective data fitting into the picture of this? How do we measure that? And I'm thinking of myself as a horse owner. How do I interpret that with my own animal, who maybe feels something more strongly than another horse? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, and it's great. Yeah, these models are revolutionizing a lot of things. I think we need to take that research approach of the 3 R's, the reduce, replace, refine, and where we can replace the real horses for models in these experiments to find out what's going on. I think it's a fantastic opportunity, and I hope that there'll be funding for something like that. And the other question of the subjective experience is it's really important to take a holistic approach at all times. I think I'm a great supporter, obviously, of the 5 domains model, and applying it so that we know that horses are living a good life. So when they are exposed to pressures and when things are not going well, they still have, they're coming at it from living a good life. And also that when we do subject horses to aversive pressures, that we do this in a situation where they have the ability to resolve the problem and to learn to avoid it in future, so they don't have to have those pressures. I mean, we have riders who can ride a Grand Prix bridleless. Yeah, that's an example of teaching the animal to perform and avoid bridle pressures altogether. So I think it's it's a good example.
My name is Christine Mensch. I'm not academic at all. I have a question and a comment. Do you think that the FEI, with their possibility of dropping or the double bridles, is that just placating, or do you think that is part of the solution? And the other comment is that I come from a stock horse background, and judges and trainers are geared primarily by monetary rewards, and until you change the judging criteria and get the judges trained to go with that, it makes no difference. And we saw this in stock horses with pleasure horses, where we had them dragging their noses on the ground and totally unathletic and flat and very disinterested, very unattractive, but very slow. And the solution took years to get judges trained to where they would instead recognize a horse that actually had quality of movement.
No, it's okay. In terms of the double bridles, we have spent a lot of time seeing or looking at dressage photos from Crispin's data sets. However, we also have archives of show jumping horses, Icelandic horses, and trotters as well. And so we can see a blue tongue with a snaffle as well, and it is more common than you would imagine. However, a lot of the pressure that is being applied here is also on the snaffle. It's not just the curb. So it's the push and pull riding that needs to be addressed. Is that culture of just going fast and being really accurate with your movements that I think should be looked at, and we should, as a society, we should, as a community of equestrians, we should ask whether we really want that to be the winning performances, or whether we use some other means of monitoring that these horses are not being exposed to such high pressures so relentlessly. So yes, I think it's a big job to change the culture and the style of riding, because of all those financial incentives as well that are baked in to the system. And thankfully, Göran has endless patience.
Cristina, thank you so much for a very rich presentation and discussion.